Hey class, welcome back to the History of Christianity. Last time we finished up with a look at a list of popes who were committing grievous acts in the papacy where they were abusing their power, they were corrupt, they were committing immorality, and just really having a time with the church. And then we looked at the Pope Leo X was selling indulgences in Germany to pay for a construction project in Rome with St. Peter's. And so what happened was Martin Luther took exception to this and sparked the Reformation with his 95 Thesis. Now we're going to pick up there later on here just in a little bit. But right now, today, we're going to insert a topic called colonial Christianity. In our timeline, it's around the same period of those popes where they were doing some things they shouldn't have been doing, and it's when Columbus landed in the New World. And so right on the heels of Columbus, the Europeans, mainly the Spanish, but also the Portuguese, but mainly the Spanish, they began sending missionaries in regards to clergy or monks to the New World to help Christianize the New World. And so we'll be looking at that here with colonial Christianity. Please don't think, I've said this before, and I'll probably say it again, but when we hear colonial Christianity, we might think of the 13 colonies in the United States. Don't think about that yet. We will get to Christianity coming to the United States later on, but for today we're going to be looking at the colonization of the New World. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay class, we're now going to move into the PowerPoint portion of this lecture for colonial Christianity. As I said earlier, don't think of the 13 colonies in America. That's going to be later on in our course when the colonies are settled in America. But what I want you to think about this time is the lands that are in Mexico and the Caribbean and South America and even Florida. We'll be looking at those because that's what we talk about with the colonization of those lands once the New World was discovered. So beginnings, on October 12th, 1492, Columbus landed on the New World. And what happened was, because he landed there under the flag of Spain, Spain set out to control this New World. But the issue with control was, and this is going to be a problem at this time, but also continuing on for a couple more centuries, is that the New World is an ocean away. And so Spain in Europe was making policy to control the conquistadors. They're the ones that were basically conquering the New World and new lands. They're in the New World. And so the policies in Spain were to keep the conquistadors in the New World from becoming rulers of landed kingdoms. The crown in Spain and the government, they did not want these conquistadors to go set up their own little private or own personally run kingdoms in the New World. They wanted to keep control of that. But that's an ocean away. And so what happened was the conquistadors were just going through the land, just exploiting everything they could. And in the end, they ended up decimating the indigenous populations. So laws that were passed in Spain were not even followed in the New World. And that would also go over some into the church. Also, decisions in the church in Spain or even in Italy, they were not always carried out the way they should be in the New World. The conquistadors viewed the indigenous population as infidels. And so they ended up just basically decimating the people. First off, disease killed a lot of the indigenous people because the conquistadors introduced new disease into a population that never experienced some of these sicknesses before. But also there was war where the conquistadors fought and killed the indigenous. And then also some were put into slavery, and slavery ended up killing many of the indigenous population. There's just a painting of Columbus landing in the Caribbean, and you can see in this painting anyway, the indigenous population is back here hiding running. Okay, continuing with some introductory material, the church gave the Spanish crown authority to appoint bishops. And of course, there was going to be financial kickbacks going back to the church for that. But they basically said, okay, Spain, you now have control over there in the New World. And the church basically said, you can set up the church over there under your crown. And that meant that they could appoint some bishops. But what happened was a two-sided church kind of developed. You had a national type church under the direction of Spain, and that's where you would think of with priests and bishops coming and kind of doing a high church type idea. And then you have the monastic led church, and this is where you think of the Franciscans or the Dominicans or the Jesuits. They're the ones that come over, and they're like monks who would who are brought to the New World to civilize the indigenous and then bring them into the church through the vein of monasticism. Okay, but one thing that did take place was Spain was not the only country involved. There was also Portugal. Portugal also was involved in exploration and finding new lands and settling new lands, especially Portugal in regards to Africa. They were spreading around. Well, Portugal also had had their sights on the New World, and once Portugal landed and Spain was there to make sure that everything was peaceable in this new exploration, Spain and Portugal decided to have a treaty, and it's called the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. And what happened was they basically drew a line on a map, and they did not know the extent of the land that lay to the west of this line. And so Spain took the land that was west of the line, and Portugal took the land that was east of the line. And so the next slide is a map, and it kind of shows how Portugal got the short end of the stick. Okay, so the solid purple line here with my arrow, that's the line for the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And you can see that this small little area of South America is going to belong to the Portuguese. And this is Brazil, part of Brazil. And the Portuguese settled this area, and even till today, the language of Brazil is Portuguese. But this is the line that was drawn for the Treaty of Tordesillas, and all of the land to the west belongs to Spain. And so you can see all of this area is going to be settled by Spain. The Caribbean, Mexico, South America, even Florida down in here. So just a lot of land that was given to Spain in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Caribbean. We're going to talk about a few different areas here that were settled, just briefly. Even though Columbus left 7 missionaries to convert the Indians, the Spanish settlers ended up devastating them through sickness and through fighting. The Spanish settlers devastated them. Well, what happened was the indigenous people, they fled to the interior of the islands, and they were ended up hunted down by the Spanish and then forced into slavery. Well, many died in the apprehension of them. Some were killed, or just in slavery they were killed. And the Spanish began importing Africans into the Caribbean from Africa so that they could be slaves and fill the spots that the slaves that had died, it filled their slots. Well, what happened was the Spanish missionaries that were trying to evangelize and trying to reach Christianize the indigenous people, they began to defend the African slavery process of bringing African slaves into the islands, because what that did was that relieved the pressure on the indigenous Indians on the Caribbean islands. And so the missionaries defended this practice because it allowed them to be able to focus their treatment on the indigenous population. All right, that was briefly the Caribbean. Now next is going to be Mexico. And again, this is just very fast overview. As Cortez conquered the Aztecs in Mexico, he established mendicant friars in the conquered lands to convert the Aztecs to Christianity. So Cortez was a very Catholic man, and even though he was ruthless and brutal and he fought wars against the Aztecs, he believed that the friars could do a good job and convert the Aztecs so that they could come under subjugation of the Spanish. Well, Cortez believed that the friars would be a better example than the Catholic clergy or the priests, because the friars lived in poverty, and that would be a better example than the Catholic clergy or priests who may believe that they should live in luxury. And so if the person's living in luxury, they might not be able to reach this indigenous population. So instead, he focused on the friars, which are monks, coming and civilizing and sharing the gospel and Christianity with the indigenous population. 12 Franciscans were successful in converting the Aztecs in their respective areas. The Aztecs believed their gods had abandoned them, and what they did was they rushed to be baptized by the Franciscans, because if their gods abandoned them, then they would come under the European god and have a religion under them, and that would bring peace with the Aztecs and then Cortez. But rushing in to be baptized, many friars were just sprinkling many indigenous, that's supposed to say many, not man, sprinkle many indigenous if they admitted that, number one, there was one God, number two, there's a Redeemer in Jesus, and then recite the Lord's Prayer. So those were the three things that they had to do before they got sprinkled for baptism: that there's one God, the Redeemer is Jesus, and recite the Lord's Prayer. And again, some of these people, they didn't even speak the Spanish, so they just said the Lord's Prayer, not even knowing what they were saying. And then they were quickly sprinkled, and there was mass baptisms by sprinkling water over a whole bunch of people. And these indigenous people were now in the fold of Christianity. Over time, the Catholic Church established clergy who were jealous of the friars' popularity, and some monks were very successful and had a large following of Aztecs. And basically what happened was the clergy accused the friars of oversimplifying baptism. But Pope Paul III, he had to step in, and he stated that that doesn't matter. No sin was committed if the salvation was oversimplified for the Indians. It's okay to sprinkle them and have them say these things they didn't even understand what they were saying, because they would be considered saved, and it was no sin with what the monks were doing. Okay, so that was the Aztecs in Mexico. Now we're going to go to Western and South America, which are the Incas, conquered by Francisco Pizarro. The Incas rebelled, but were also fighting amongst themselves. And so because it was such a tumultuous time, King Charles of Spain sent reinforcements in, and that led to many Incas being killed. However, over time, there were churches that were established. In 1581, a huge archdiocese was set up under the Archbishop of Lima, which is in Peru, under Alfonso de Mogrovejo. And I hope I said that name right, but that's his name there on the screen. And so Alfonso was made archbishop of this area that is just massive. It includes Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, and parts of Chile and Argentina. So just a massive landmass that became this diocese for this archbishop. So the Spanish church, the Catholic Church, was really getting a grip on a large area of land, and obviously the Incas that were in the land. Okay, next we're going to talk about Florida. Florida was discovered and landed on by the Spanish. Ponce de Leon landed on Florida in 1513, but had some violent incidents with the Indians that were there in Florida. Several expeditions over the next several years came in and were trying to civilize the land. In 1528, an entire expedition was wiped out. And then what happened was 8 years later, 4 survivors from that expedition showed up in Mexico. And what they did was they walked across half of the American continent to get to Mexico from where they were at. But the reason I bring this up was that it's important to know that the Spanish landed in Florida, but also because of how the Indians reacted, there was it was a limited missionary activity because the Indians were violent, and then there was also rivalries going on with the English and the French who were exploring the area also. So there was not a lot of missionary activity in Florida. Not saying there was not any, but it was just limited compared to the movement, let's say, in Mexico, where all of these monks and monastic orders and clergy were all brought in. Florida was a little different. And that's it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second. Class, that's it for today's lesson, and it actually brings our time to a close for this section in our course, which was medieval Christianity. So the first part of our course was the early church and the patristics, and then the second part was medieval Christianity, and we've just ended that now. Next time, we are going to be looking at our third part of our course, which is the Reformation and the things that follow right after the Reformation. So other than that, I don't have anything else. Keep up on the reading. Take care.